Hello, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar interview today. I'm Francis Seeley from GlobalNet 21 and from Enfield Voices. And this is one of the many interviews we do, many webinars we do, where we look at some of the big issues that face us today, both locally, nationally, as well as globally as well. And today we're going to look at local government and scrutiny. Now, we've done several webinars in the past on local government, and particularly local government democracy, but we haven't specifically looked at local government scrutiny, the role of councillors to be able to hold their council to account and to ask critical questions. Now, we're going to interview today Derek Levy. Now, Derek is a councillor. He was a Labour councillor and now an independent councillor, and he had for some years been chair of the Scrutiny Committee, what's called the Overview and Scrutiny Committee in local government. Now, the role of scrutiny is very important in local government. It is a function of some councillors to hold their local authority to account, to ask questions about the decisions they take. And when local government was reformed in the 1990s, it was considered that councillors had three roles they could take up, and one of those was scrutiny. And that meant finding councillors who had the ability and the inclination to ask detailed questions and to investigate what their council was doing. Of course, the other roles were equally important, and one of them was the role of the councillor with their community, their local ward. Not only should they be caseworkers, but they had a very vital role in being leaders in their community and taking up the issues that their community, that their ward thought was important. And the third function that councillors could get involved in was in the administration, the executive, or as it's called, the cabinet in some councils, most councils nowadays. And you can see the cabinet in North London Borough of Enfield here, right in this picture. Now, of all those functions, scrutiny was one that was considered as important. And it was important because it is vital to be able to question what the council does. And in order to do that, it was considered that the scrutiny committee and those councillors involved in scrutiny should be independent from the council. Now, many councils have had problems in dealing with that and tackling with that and having the necessary separation of powers that makes local democracy work. And in this webinar interview, we're going to look at this, and we're going to look at this particularly in one borough in North London, and that's the London Borough of Enfield. Okay, so let's begin this and take us on the journey through what scrutiny is and how it can function well. And we began the interview by talking to Derek Levy and first asking him to tell us a little about himself.
I have lived in Enfield since 1988, 32 years. I graduated from Tottenham, so in 65 years I've managed to make it 6 miles up the road, which isn't a lot of progress geographically, but I think I've moved quite a way in life. Went to university. I'm a social scientist by training, history and social sciences, so I've got a little bit of psychology, sociology, bit of law minor, all of which is relevant to some of which we're going to talk about later on tonight. I mean, I became a councillor in 2010 at the age of 55, and I like to think I'm defined less by what I've done since 2010, but all the 55 years preceding that, developing a wide range of skills, knowledge, expertise, capabilities, transferable into local government. I was an officer in council, by the way, once as well.
Okay. So, I mean, you know, you've had a varied background. Yep. And you got involved in the council and you got involved in scrutiny. Now, some people wonder what scrutiny means. I mean, they know what the word means, but in terms of local government, what is scrutiny?
Okay, well, not as simple as even in your introduction. I mean, scrutiny, overview and scrutiny is like a layer of onions. You peel certain things off, but fundamentally it is, in the main, designed to hold an executive to account. It actually has its roots, I suppose, if you think about Charles I and the English Civil War and Parliament trying to challenge the divine right of kings. And essentially, and it's something I think Rob Wilson said last week, that in liberal democracy, a representative democracy, whether it's national or local, it really is about having the checks and balances and separating the powers between an executive, the legislature, and of which the Overview and Scrutiny Committee, I suppose, is the conduit to the people. It's the voice of the people. It's a conduit for the people that all 63 councillors Enfield represent, to ask the questions the public don't always have. So it's about holding to account. But I will just say, before I stop at this point, is that it's not just being pernickety and pulling things apart and challenging and arguing and, if you like, opposing. Scrutiny is not opposition. Actually, it's about being a critical friend, having an independent mindset. It's about asking questions to better understand, to help inform and improve decision making within the council, chiefly by the executive and their officers.
Okay, so that's a function, but so people understand, because many people won't know, how is that function organised in the council?
Okay, well, in Enfield, there is an Overview and Scrutiny Committee. It has traditionally been made up proportionately in terms of how the council is composed. So the Overview and Scrutiny Committee is, if you like, the best of the best. The committee was, when I was chairing it for 4 years, made up of 6 people. Each of the 6, myself included, were chairs in our own right. So I chaired the Overview and Scrutiny Committee and kind of took ownership and managed the function of scrutiny that I just talked about. My colleagues would chair other committees, health scrutiny, crime scrutiny, some of the work streams, and historically departmental committee work streams. But when we all meet together as a group of Overview and Scrutiny Committee, it does tend to be to look at the more substantive issues of the council, either decisions that need to be talked about or have been called in because there might be weaknesses in it, or under my chairmanship, I used to invite people to come in, cabinet members, chief executive, leader of the council, to actually probe them without using the call-in process, but also setting a very balanced and substantive work programme at the beginning of each year to make sure we used our meeting time to discuss things that mattered rather than were perfunctory and were just ticking boxes and noting reports. Wanted to make it very proactive. And the final point to answer your question, it's very important, I believe, that it's not just post-decision scrutiny, but the oversight that comes from the overview is about actually helping to inform policy and inform the decisions not yet taken. And pre-decision scrutiny, to me, is a very vital component of the scrutiny role in the Overview and Scrutiny Committee.
Okay, I mean, when local government was sort of reorganised in the 1950s, they looked at 3 functions of local government. One was the executive, the people who take the decisions. The other was the council themselves and their role as leaders in the community, and the other was scrutiny. Yeah. And they felt that scrutiny should be totally independent of the executive and the administration. How vital, in your view, is that?
I mean, personally, I've always felt that the chair of Overview and Scrutiny Committee should actually be independent, i.e. not even a councillor, much like some of the other committees have, or some of the safeguarding panels or fostering panels. But it's not so much the badge that one wears or the scarf that one wears in the committee. It's about a mindset. It's about the ability to actually sit on your hands and park your political position or your persuasion and simply be able to actually look at an issue independently, ask questions independently, don't make them coloured by one's own views, because actually the opinions of members of the committee isn't what's important, it's the questions that the committee member asks of the participants, whether it's a senior officer or a cabinet member or even an external invitee, for example. So it's a capacity and a mindset to be independent, but within a local government structure, short of having 6 people who are independent from the outside as opposed to councillors, I think it's the mindset has to trump the independence, and it is about the calibre of the people, the experience of the people, and the ability to have a knowledge of the wide range of council decisions. Actually, scrutiny members probably have to know more about more portfolios and individual portfolio holders.
Okay, so it's quite interesting that you say that, in your view, the chair should be independent of the political parties on the council. But of course, that didn't happen when you were chair, and it hasn't happened since. And there's a problem when the controlling party of the council is also the controlling party on the scrutiny committee, because sometimes the leader, the executive, might think that you should work hand in glove. And you sort of fell foul of that, didn't you? And the executive, the leader, had to be held up for breach of council conduct because of their relationship with you. Could you tell us about that?
Okay. Well, I don't think I fell foul of anything, Francis. I think the foul was committed elsewhere. But the important, look, my answer to your previous question was all about the fact that because of the checks and balances and the importance of checks and balances in the democratic process and the accountability of the executive, it's really, really important that the functions are separated. And therefore, if anybody, and I mean, and we're not here talking about an individual, I was chairman of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee, a member of the executive, of one of the 10 members of the cabinet, felt that the scrutiny committee should be more aligned to the decisions that the party was taking. And I, when that was first put to me, replied very simply, I think this is inappropriate, compromising and incriminating, and my considered advice is you to withdraw and let it go. Unfortunately, that advice was not heeded, and that particular member doubled down and actually felt that I was not, and suggested that scrutiny has a role somewhat different from the way that I have described it. And I felt, in order to preserve the integrity and the credibility of the scrutiny function, and to an extent, me personally, and also my fellow committee members, it was important to formally take the complaint route, because the function, the credibility and the integrity and the independence of the scrutiny function had to be preserved. And I was standing up for the function. It wasn't personal to me, and it wasn't personal against the subject of my complaint.
Okay. You say that the person concerned who talks about the leader, I know, felt that there should be more cooperation, but and it wasn't going the way that she would like. Yeah. But it's not for her to say, is it? Scrutiny is independent. It is for you, the scrutiny committee, to say the executive, whoever they are, should keep out of it.
Well, which is exactly what I did, and that is why, obviously, through the complaints procedure, one has to bring a complete body of evidence. And the crux of my complaint was around that particular issue, a series of emails around about the 24th of October in 2018, it would have been, and which I sought to preserve the integrity. I cited the evidence. The email was so self-evident, it was prima facie evidence. The complaint was investigated outside of the council by a practicing solicitor who herself was a former monitoring officer, director of law and governance to major city council in the north of England. And she found absolutely that I did the right thing. It was important that I stood up for the separation of powers, and that, in her own words, a less experienced councillor may not have recognised what was actually going on. And more to the point, what she actually said in her judgment was that it's a very serious matter, because if you don't protect that function, the implications of that are serious for the decision making and the quality of the decisions being made if the scrutiny function is being compromised or attempted to be compromised and undermined. And if you have poor decision making, that brings requisites, or potentially brings reputational damage upon the council itself, potentially legal action by those who want to challenge decisions. So it's not just a matter of opinion that scrutiny should be this way or other way. It has wider ramifications, and Derek Levy writing a complaint against the leader of the council. It's a preservation matter.
It seems to me, from what I've seen, and I could be wrong on this, but the approach to scrutiny in Enfield could be described as minimalist. I mean, with scrutiny, the Centre for Public Scrutiny and many others recommend that there should be 3 stages of scrutiny. You should scrutinise before a decision is taken, when a decision is taken, and afterwards there should be a post-mortem. I don't ever see that happening in Enfield. It's not as comprehensive as that.
You may not see it now, but I have to say, in the period of time, in the 4 years between May 2015 and May 2019, a lot more of that was going on. And I do have to use my experience here, my experience to illustrate the point. When I became the chair of Overview and Scrutiny, I always felt and wanted to see the scrutiny function in Enfield owned by the councillors, in particular owned by the committee, for the reasons I outlined earlier on about the function of scrutiny. And I took as my model the select committee model that exists in Parliament. And by the way, you'll know, Francis, that a lot of select committees are chaired by members of the opposition to the national government, but also members of. So the select committees have a variance on them, as indeed does it in Enfield. We've got some chairs who are Conservative at the moment. So I did that, and unbeknownst to me, I was following a best practice model that I now know to be laid out by the Centre for Public Scrutiny, with whom I had a very close working relationship. So the history behind that, Francis, was that for a long, long time, scrutiny was not even owned by the executive. It was a fiefdom of a particular officer who ran the scrutiny function. And it therefore, it was doing some very good quality work, but it wasn't owned by the councillors. I wanted to invert that. So, for example, in previous meetings, and other chairs went along with this, previous chairs went along with this, officers or councillors came in, spoke for about 20 minutes, and there's 5 minutes left for questioning. I turned that on its tail. I said, we've seen your report, we've seen the papers published, we're all here, give us a 5-minute précis of it, and let's have 25 minutes to question you. That was whether it was a pre-decision, or whether or not it was a substantive meeting, or indeed a call-in. And I went further than that. Not only did I do that, I used some of the set-aside days for call-ins to invite cabinet members in on a one-to-one basis to explain their portfolio and justify it outwith of the call-in. I instituted meetings that were single agenda items, because I think it was important that sometimes we didn't give enough scrutiny to big issues like Meridian Water and such like. And in the case of the work streams, the work stream models that was going on behind Overview and Scrutiny, they were being monitored. I wrote a report personally on the quality of communications. Most recently, I did one on loneliness and social isolation. And there's a monitoring structure built into the work stream model. And there's some other good work. Modern slavery, the work that Mike Rye chaired a couple of years ago on modern slavery, paved the way for the charter that the council signed. So actually, I would say, Francis, in conclusion, the scrutiny function did actually meet those 3 criteria in the 4 years I was there. It may not do that now, but I can only explain what happened in my tenure.
So, I mean, from what you're saying, how important is it for, the chairman to be strong, to be proactive, and to get the committee to work together and set an agenda?
I think it's vital, and that's not about trumpet blowing. It's just as a matter of circumstantial. Look, as I said earlier on, all the other committee members are chairs in their own right. So one will chair crime scrutiny, one will chair health scrutiny, others will chair work stream, and they must chair in their own right. And in their meetings, they must be strong and assertive. But I'm speaking from the perspective of the function as a whole via the Overview and Scrutiny. The role of the chair, the importance is meeting management is critical to actually ensure the right questions are asked, the time is utilised well, all the participants, both as members of the committee, remembering it is a meeting of the committee, it's not a meeting of the guests, it's a meeting of the committee members. Everybody should have their say. The cabinet members and the officers aren't there to actually be on the defence. It's not cross-examination. We actually are a team. This is about critical friendship, but it's about meeting management. And the analogy I used, and I did have a unique and perhaps distinct style, is that the chair needs to be strong and assertive to uphold the integrity of the meetings, but it's like a conductor in an orchestra. It's about drawing people in. It's about making sure that somebody who hasn't spoken gets called in. It's making sure that people get a chance to answer. It's making sure that committee members don't voice their own opinions, but use their time meaningfully to tease out what we need to do to scrutinise. And at the end of it, have conclusions that are outcomes or recommendations. So the role of the chair, and a strong and assertive chair, is critical, but different people chair in different ways, and I recognise that.
Yeah, I mean, I looked in last week at the scrutiny committee that took place then, that was looking at the financial situation of the council, and it was a shambles. It seemed to me that it had no focus at all. It seemed to me that they hadn't met together beforehand. They hadn't decided what the focus is, what the objectives were, what the outcomes should be. They hadn't developed a consensual view of what questions should be asked, so the questions were all over the place. I mean, how important is it for them to get their act in order before they have the real thing?
I think it's important, if it can be done, to have a pre-meeting of the members, but it's not always practical and it's not always possible, which is why the strength of a chair is important in setting out the guideline for that meeting at the very top of the meeting. Ideally, yes, a pre-meet, but most of the members of the committee are reasonably experienced, and certainly by the end of the municipal year have come to grips with their relationship with the chair. But my style was to simply say at the front of the meeting, both to my committee members and those who are in the meeting, these are the rules of engagement, this is how it's going to be played, this is what we're going to do, this is what I will allow, this is what I won't allow, and the focus is really about questions and answers and not making it a soapbox session. Now, you referred to what was going on last week, and I kind of deliberately kept away from it because I wanted to keep a clear mind for what I knew was happening today. But from what little I saw of it, or the meet, I can't remember if it was last week or 2 weeks ago, but what little I saw and what I have heard about it and your own analysis of it, it wasn't an overview and scrutiny committee meeting. Nominally it was, because the committee members were there. But if you spend an hour of that meeting, the best part of, where the invited guests are simply using it as a soapbox, and if the best part of the next 20 minutes are dominated by a chair asking questions, that disenfranchises the rest of the committee and it undermines the committee. So I would argue, from my observations without being there, that it wasn't a meeting of the scrutiny in any great sense. It was a shambles, and a meeting of the way it's been described would not have happened had I been in the chair. And I mean, I won't say it now, but I mean, there was another example of that earlier in the year, last year, at the budget scrutiny meeting, where a very similar situation played out, where the members of the committee were, I won't say were dominated by an assertive chair, but were dominated by a chair who asked too many questions at the front end and didn't allow other people to have their say. So it raises question marks at the moment, and I can only say question marks, as to whether or not scrutiny currently is as robust as it should be, and certainly is as robust as it has more recently been.
I mean, you mentioned earlier, didn't you, the select committees in the House of Commons, which in a way is a good model because they're the chair, always make sure all the members have time to make their points and keeps their input to the minimum. And, you know, the meeting last week, 45 minutes of a 90-minute meeting was taken up by presentations from the executive, and it looked like a PR exercise for the executive. Now, somehow you've got to avoid that if you're going to do proper scrutiny, haven't you?
Well, I'm going to have to be careful how I answer this question. But yeah, I mean, on the one hand, the chair must avoid that. As I said, when I would set a meeting up, I would say, we've read your papers. I said earlier on, I'll give you 5 minutes to lay the ground rules. That is all you're going to have to say. If the way you've described last week's meeting, the way you discussed wider issues of democracy and accountability, the way that other communications between the current executive and backbench councillors out with as a scrutiny function at the moment are going ahead, it could be argued that currently there is an active avoidance of accountability, and the scrutiny committee, if you like, is almost a primus inter pares. It's the most front-facing area of accountability that would be being undermined. I'm just saying that a meeting of the kind you witnessed last week wouldn't have happened under my chair. That's not to criticise the current chair. You could say that's down to inexperience. There may be other issues at play, but I'm not going to assert that because it's not right for me to do so. I just think it wasn't a scrutiny meeting. And perhaps the greatest disappointment of that for me, if I'm going to be critical, is going to be critical of those more experienced members of that committee, some of whom have been councillors for 20 or more years, who didn't actually stamp their feet and stamp the table and actually assert themselves, because they're all chairs, remember. They are all chairs in their own right. So they have a responsibility too.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, councillors should learn to stamp their feet. The other thing was that, you know, lots of people talk about scrutiny as being a whole community affair. We should involve the community, citizens. We should get, you know, people from our local communities involved in scrutiny. Now, in that particular meeting last week, it was online and there was an opportunity to use social networks and get a lot of people involved. And when we don't have the pandemic, there's an opportunity to go out to the community and take the scrutiny committee outside. But last week, only 5 people, I think, that's what they said, maybe more came on later, turned up, and they weren't asked, any of them, to ask any questions at all. I mean, limiting and preventing the public from being actively involved doesn't put scrutiny in a good sort of light, does it?
It doesn't. I mean, look, I'm going to defend it to an extent that I think going forward, the experience that many people have had in the last couple of months of the likes of Zoom and House Party and meetings such as this to show that one can broaden things out digitally is a model that could be built up. But it's a very rarefied atmosphere at the moment. To have any meeting, whether it's a cabinet meeting or a scrutiny meeting, done by this means where there could be 10 or 20 or 30 people on the screen, is kind of artificial and it's difficult. So I will excuse it to an extent, although I do believe the opportunity is there, and going forward, I think there's a good model. In terms of involving the public, in the past, members of the public were invited and did actually come to the conference room where meetings were taken. Sometimes councillors invited groups of people to their own work streams. And I did my best, certainly when I was in the chair, to make sure that those members of the public who attended got the chance to ask a question, maybe after the committee members had their say first, but call them in. And more to the point of that, in the 4 years there, we brought the Youth Parliament. I brought the Youth Parliament in. So we actually had members of the Youth Parliament long before they sat at the top table in full council next to the mayor. And there was a wonderful guy who was actually all over the media last week called Theo Sergio. You may have heard about Theo. Theo is an amazing, dynamic young individual who's had a whole range of problems, but he's going to be a politician going forward. And Theo would come along and he would ask fantastically searching and perspicacious. We also had co-opted members on that committee. So we had members from the church and from schools. So I would say we have involved the public in the past. Public have come along. When they came along, in particular to the budget scrutiny, which is the one you get the greatest outcome from, it's really important to call them in. But I do take your point, Francis. I think there is plenty of scope to do more, to be more outreaching. And actually, one of the things that was on my to-do list, had I carried on in the chair, was to take scrutiny meetings out of Civic Centre and take them into the community.
I was thinking, I mean, for example, in Enfield, where we live, you could hold a scrutiny meeting in the Dugdale Centre. You could get social networks to advertise it and promote it. Yeah. We could build the place up. You could have an independent facilitator helping to develop it. And scrutiny could be a live and buzzing affair, which people would consider to be really important. Well, now they hardly know what it is.
I don't disagree. I mean, when councillors do what were ward forums, they used to be area forums, but I mean, they're now ward forums. In my previous life, when I was in Southbury Ward, in Enfield North, and even in Southgate, I made it very clear that those ward forums should not be held in the Civic Centre because it made it look like it was a council meeting. Ward forums, for example, are meetings of the public. They are meetings of the public where they get an opportunity to drive the agenda to meet their local councillors. So in my ward now of Southgate, I've been to the far north up in Eversley School. I've been to the bottom left-hand corner, in the top northern corner at the British Legion. I've been in central Southgate. I've been to different schools, and it's about taking it. And I actually think council meetings as a whole should be taken physically on the road. scrutiny is a perfect example, especially if you have a particular, say Meridian Water, for example, which is going to be ongoing it's been ongoing since probably Noah was in the ark, and it's going to probably go forward till the next Noah comes round. But those meetings should be held somewhere in Edmonton at some point. If you're going to have a dedicated meeting, I would say, my caveat, Francis, to your point, I wouldn't necessarily take an overview and scrutiny meeting out with a 4 or 5 item agenda and have to draw the whole body of people down. But if it's a single item agenda and it's localized and it's relevant and resonant amongst the people of a certain part, then yes, by all means, and digital can back it up or reinforce it. I would be all for that. I didn't do enough of it myself. I didn't do too badly in my 4 years, I think.
No, I'm sure you didn't, and I mean that's interesting you say that, and I agree about the one issue one should be taken out, not the one with a huge agenda. We're getting very close to the end. It's gone very quickly, but if you were to make one recommendation to Enfield to improve scrutiny, to give more sort of ascendancy to the scrutiny function, what would it be?
Just look back 12 months and rewind for 4 years before it, because actually the principle of the system ain't broke. To use the words of Banana Armour and the Funboint 3, it ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it that gets results. And I think, I'm not going to say under my stewardship it was perfect or brilliant all the time, but because it followed the guidance and the model of the Centre for Public Scrutiny, and I stuck to that, and because I made innovations and changes, for the most part, the scrutiny function worked quite well. One point, this is going to be a bit controversial, I realise, but I actually think Scrutiny Committee is one of the few that you might need to handpick the members of it. And I also will go as far as to say I don't think it has to follow proportionality of party line. As I said earlier on, the Scrutiny Committee is looking at every single facet of the council, from detailed finances right the way down to through safeguarding to street furniture and whatever. And it has a wide range of brief, and it does require a certain type of mindset and caliber of person to ask the right kind of question. I don't think it's a committee where you simply just say, well, we need 7 people, so we'll have him, her, and him, because that's just doing lip service to the function. I actually think there is scope to make it robust, and with no disrespect in newer, inexperienced councillors, experience does count, and it's not about age. There are a lot of people who've been on the council for 25 years who don't know how to ask a question. So it's not about age, it's about capacity, capability, and individual. So I think I would say re-examine how things were 4 years over the past 4 years. Go back to basics, take ownership. All members of the committee take ownership, and be clear that if there aren't any checks and balances, there shouldn't be a scrutiny system at all. You may as well throw it in the dustbin and all go home.
Okay, and one final question then, and that is, if people wanted to find out more about scrutiny and what it does, where would they go?
Then I would actually advise people to go to the organisation, as I said, called the Centre for Public Scrutiny. They've also got a very, very good website. They hold a whole range of events, training events. They are paid. And I would urge people to actually go through them because they are independent. The guy who fronts that up for the areas that we work with is a guy called Ed Hammond. He's totally bonkers, but he knows scrutiny inside out. He's very hands-on. He's a great communicator, does great lectures and hands-on. I will say, since this is being broadcast and I've got more time on my hands than normal, I'm perfectly happy to answer general questions if people want to know a little bit more. Formally, I suppose I should say they should contact Jeremy Chambers, who's the Director of Law and Governance in the Council, who oversees the staff who support the scrutiny function. But, you know, people will draw their own conclusions from the answers I've given here today. But I'm laying myself open for phone calls and emails. And by the way, people, I much prefer to talk on the phone than send emails, because you get more done if you talk.
Okay, now you've opened yourself up to that, so
I know.
let's see what happens.
Got to get out of my social isolation bubble.
Mike, this is your desperate way to get company. I know. Anyhow, thanks, Derek. I mean, that's been really interesting because, you know, I think in Enfield, and not just in Enfield, in lots of local authorities, scrutiny needs to be really looked at because it is an important part of local government. It's an essential part of local government. It's a way of keeping the executive accountable, and therefore we should always look at it, try to change it, try to improve it and reform it. So I think you've helped us today, so thank you for doing that. And,
my pleasure. I'll say goodbye to you, and I'll say goodbye to anyone who's watching.
Yeah, okay, well, thank you, and we'll end this interview now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.